Hi, I'm excited to talk to you today about an important and impactful facet of data collection. What do we do when the data we collect contradict each other? Today we're going to talk about administrative data. Administrative data is data that's collected to run social programs, such as homeless services, food assistance, and others. When administrative data from places like homeless services, food assistance, and schools is linked, people's interactions across systems and over time can be traced. This linked data can be used to implement better programs and to address social needs more effectively. So today we'll focus on how administrative data is linked across systems and how demographic information like race and gender is represented in the data. We'll also see how experiential knowledge of people represented in these data systems can help us interpret the data and use it to advance social good. So thanks for joining me here today.
All right, so as you can see, we are in Module 2 of our teaching modules on how to address bias in administrative data systems. So in Module 1, remember we reviewed the FAIR2 framework, which is a framework for integrating community knowledge in data analytics and addressing discrimination bias. So now we're going to jump into Module 2, which is going to provide an example of using the FAIR2 framework to seek out that experiential knowledge and to integrate it into our data analytics.
So to illustrate administrative data, let's first talk about Aaron. This is Aaron. So we can see here that Aaron was born in 2006, but Aaron doesn't know much about their early years, though they know that their parents had them very young and they struggled to make ends meet. Neither of Aaron's parents had any family that lived nearby, so Aaron knows that they sometimes got help from local food pantries and federal programs like SNAP, which is food assistance. On the left side of the slide, we can see how Aaron's demographic information was recorded each time their family received any type of federal benefit. We can also see that Aaron's family interacted with the Homeless Management Information System, which is HMIS. So when you see HMIS in these slides, we're talking about homeless services. And so we know that perhaps Aaron's family received housing assistance, though it sounds like Aaron might not have known about this. We can also see that it looks like Aaron's race was recorded slightly different, sometimes as Black, sometimes as multiracial. We also see that the data was recorded about Aaron's family via SNAP, which is the Supplemental Nutrition Program or food assistance data. So here we're looking at data about Aaron collected by housing and food assistance programs over the years. This slide here shows what's going on between 2011 and 2020. So throughout elementary school and middle school, Aaron's family moved around a lot based on where their parents could find work. Aaron remembers that sometimes money would get tight around the end of the month, but their parents always found a way to get by. Now that Aaron has entered school, we see how their demographic information was also recorded in the school system. Note that the school only has one code that encompasses both race and ethnicity, whereas the other systems record race and ethnicity separately. We also see that there are 3 different administrative databases that contain information about Aaron, but the information recorded about Aaron's race is not the same in the different systems. This slide is looking at Aaron in high school. So Aaron's very happy that their family was able to spend all 4 years of high school in the same city. They finally felt like they fit in after making friends with a group of other LGBTQ+ students and started to explore both their gender identity and racial identity. Having parents from 2 different racial backgrounds, Aaron was never quite sure where they fit in. Aaron's high school friends helped them form their own understanding of their identities. After high school, Aaron's parents moved again, but Aaron decided to stay in the same city they now called home. This is the first time that we see Aaron reporting their own demographic information on the left side of the slide. We see that they self-reported their race, ethnicity, and gender identities to the school system starting in high school. Note that their gender identity changed to other gender when they self-reported it as they were going through developmental stages of identity development. This slide is looking at the time immediately after high school for Aaron. So Aaron knew that they wanted to get a college education, but wanted to earn some income as well. So they immediately started a part-time job at a local restaurant while applying for college. It wasn't enough money to make ends meet, so Aaron found themselves applying for Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, services. With SNAP in their part-time job, Aaron was able to rent a small apartment and take a couple of college classes up until a few weeks ago. Aaron had been growing more confident in their gender expression and identity, but unfortunately that brought on multiple ongoing customer complaints at the restaurant they worked at. Unfortunately, Aaron's manager thought it would be easier to let Aaron go and appease the customers, so Aaron suddenly became unemployed with no way to pay next month's rent. Now that Aaron is an adult, we see that all of their information from high school graduation onward is self-reported. We also see that Aaron's gender differs based on the system they're in. Unknown for SNAP, non-binary, then male for the HMIS homeless data. Aaron has applied for some housing assistance, but will soon lose the apartment. Aaron has been looking into homeless shelters in the area, but is concerned they won't feel safe at the men's shelter and won't be allowed in the women's shelter. On top of all that, Aaron never got around to changing their ID and document from male and isn't sure what to do about all the forms they know they have to fill out for housing assistance. Now we want to keep Aaron in mind as we learn about how we can use linked administrative data and people's stories, their own personal experiential knowledge. So first, what is integrated administrative data? So linked administrative data is created when information about the same person from different public systems, like from HMIS and SNAP and school, is cleaned, matched using info like their name and date of birth, and connected via a unique ID. The schematic here shows 3 data sources, HMIS, SNAP, and school data. We see that they have some similarities. They each contain name, date of birth, and a system-specific ID, and some types of demographic information. Then they have some other data that is specific to the system. For example, HMIS has the date of service, such as the date entered into a homeless shelter, whereas SNAP has the month of enrollment, and school systems have a year and grade someone was in. Now we take all that info and first we clean it. Next, we link on name and date of birth because we can see that all 3 of our individual systems have those 2 variables. Finally, we create a unique ID, like a set of random de-identified numbers that's matched to the particular individual and matched to the specific system they're in. This way, if we get another record from one of the individual systems for that person, we can immediately link them to their integrated record in the integrated data system. All this together creates a larger integrated system where we can look across all these smaller systems. These integrated data systems allow us to see how individuals interact with multiple programs over time. When we use data systems for research purposes like this, we do so in a protected, secure environment in order to help keep everyone's information safe and confidential. What we have to be aware of, and what we will talk about in this presentation, is that data do not speak for themselves. These data represent people with real lived experiences, and we have to make sure that we're tapping on their expertise and insight so that we can make best use of their data. Here's an example of what an integrated data system might look like. We get integrated data systems by linking together multiple administrative data systems. Thinking about Aaron, we know that their family sought housing services early on in Aaron's life. We also know that Aaron's family intermittently received SNAP during Aaron's school age years, and we know that Aaron, as an adult, received SNAP. So Aaron appears in these different administrative data systems: school data, SNAP data, and homelessness data. In a way, Aaron is representing the population on the left: people experiencing homelessness, students, and people experiencing food insecurity. Remember how Aaron felt uncomfortable with the idea of seeking homeless shelter services? Keep in mind that not everyone in these different populations will end up in their respective databases. That is what the dotted line represents. So even if Aaron loses their apartment, they may not end up seeking homeless shelter. Regardless, we know that throughout Aaron's life, there are records in each of these systems with Aaron's name on them. What we can do is link all these different records together based on Aaron's name and date of birth. Names and birthdays don't usually change, so we can confidently say that Aaron in one data system is the Aaron in another data system. And I just want to say, I also understand that sometimes names do change. This linking is what creates our integrated data system. From there, we can do all sorts of cleaning and coding to look at the variables of interest. Here we focus on race, ethnicity, and gender. One big challenge with linked administrative data is how race and gender get recorded. Different systems collect this information in different ways. So when we link data on the same person across programs, we can end up with multiple versions of their race or gender. There's no clear rule about how to combine this information in a way that both supports equity and recognizes that race and gender are social constructs, not fixed traits. One way to tap on the expertise of people represented in data systems is to conduct a data chat. A data chat is a method of leveraging experiential knowledge where researchers and people with lived experience share and discuss data. Data chats are rooted in the FAIR2 framework for identifying bias in social data science. To learn more about how demographic data is collected in social service provision, we held 2 data chats in Cleveland, Ohio. We recruited participants from the greater Cleveland community using the flyers on the right, and we encouraged young adults with lived experience of homelessness and identifying as racial, ethnic, and gender minorities to participate. In the following slides, we'll share some examples of data that we presented to participants, as well as some of the insights that were gathered from their knowledge. Some information that we shared with data chat participants included summary statistics of data linked across the 3 systems that Aaron is in: HMIS, SNAP, and the school system data. We focused on young adults like Aaron, aged 18 to 25. When we linked individuals, we wanted to focus on how we cope with different classifications of race and gender identity across different agencies and across time. Among different agencies, we see that demographic data is collected in different ways. There may be different options available for someone to identify themselves in the different systems, which we can see here in this slide. We also see that the options can change across time in the same system. So here we see that in HMIS, the options for gender changed from 2017 to 2021. For example, in 2021, there's an option to identify outside of a gender binary, whereas in 2017, all of the options were either male, female, or trans female, trans male. So when we linked individuals together, the goal is to map each agency's classification into a standardized common categorization that minimizes the loss of inclusive options in the linked data and maximizes diverse identities. However, even after we do our very best to do this, we see that there are individuals that have mismatches in demographic data over time. Aaron would be one of these individuals. On the left, we see a small percentage of people that had a mismatch in their race category over time. On the right, we see a small percentage of people that had a mismatch in their gender category over time. For both, we see that an increasing number of records, as well as an increasing number of different agencies that one is involved with, increases the likelihood that we may see these mismatches. Our data chat participants, people like Aaron, help us contextualize why we might see these mismatches and what to do about it. Our first finding was around agency-defined demographic categories. Agencies like homeless shelters, schools, and SNAP have their own options for how a person can identify themselves. We see that these options are not fixed either, meaning that within the same agency, we see that these options may change over time. This is because agency-defined classifications are rooted in social norms and largely reflect the society in which they are being defined. Our second finding was around people who changed their name. Our data chat participants identified two groups of people who may be more likely to change their name: transgender individuals and individuals who age out of foster care or get adopted. If you remember earlier, we said that we link individuals' records by their name and date of birth, thinking that these categories are objective. Here we see that if someone changes their name, we may not be able to link them. Therefore, they may actually appear as two different people in the integrated data system. For trans and gender diverse folks, this likely creates an undercount of that population, while possibly also inflating other categories. Our third finding was around the data intake process itself. Data chat participants helped us realize that there are many factors that influence the process and what data ends up getting reported. We know that people seeking services who are already in a vulnerable situation are going to navigate these social service agencies in ways that feel the most safe and least stigmatizing, while also trying to meet their basic needs. Remember how Aaron was grappling with the idea of feeling unsafe at a men's homeless shelter? This is an example of how Aaron is thinking about how they will get their housing needs met, but in the safest way possible. Data chat participants also highlighted the burden of the data collection process itself. They emphasized that collecting all this additional information is burdensome when people are in such vulnerable situations. Revisiting this schematic, we see two areas that are ripe for social bias. The first area is in the administrative data systems themselves, as agencies define categories on their own forms. The second area is when researchers make decisions on how to clean and standardize all that administrative data as they link records across multiple systems. Now we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about what our data chat participants shared with us and how that shapes our understanding of integrated data systems. First, we asked participants what they would suggest to improve the data collection process itself. Participants called for the need for inclusive and standardized options. They pointed out that some forms can even be confusing, such as only asking for sex versus only asking for gender. And participants didn't always see their identities represented in the options. So how do you answer the questions? Participants also called for a standardized data collection process, noting how some forms were self-reported and some forms were filled out by a provider who asked them questions. Furthermore, sometimes these forms were online, while others were on paper or in person. Finally, participants emphasized the need for providers to have adequate training on how to ask sensitive questions in the hopes of reducing implicit bias. Next, we asked data chat participants if there were any situations in the data intake process that may cause them to not want to answer questions about their social identities. Were there any situations that made them uncomfortable disclosing personal information? We learned that the disclosure of personal information is influenced by safety, stigma, and the concern for receiving services, and the level and urgency of someone's needs. First, data chat participants explained that they navigate social agencies in ways that feel safest and least stigmatizing to them. For some folks, that may mean choosing not to disclose certain information about their identities. In fact, it may be a lot safer to choose not to disclose personal information. One of our participants even said, if you're not a cisgender person, you are looked at as the most dangerous person. But in my eyes, a cisgender person is the most dangerous person to me. Next, participants pointed out that disclosing information may depend on what services they're trying to receive, and they may choose what to disclose or not to disclose based on what may get them their needs met. An important consideration for transgender folks is that their documents must match. Remember how Erin was thinking that their gender marker still said male on all their documents? This may impact how Erin decides to report their gender identity for fear of their documents not matching their self-report and the impact this has on receiving services. Finally, someone's level of urgency of need may impact what they disclose. After all, they're trying to get their basic needs met, things like housing and food. Next, we asked DataChat participants about the importance of collecting demographic variables. Is it important to collect race, ethnicity, and gender? If so, why? And how does that data intake experience address your needs or fall short? DataChat participants highlighted 2 areas where data collection may be important: for funding purposes and for identifying gaps. For funding, participants noted that sometimes funding sources themselves require this information, but also funding is sometimes available for certain populations, so it's important to know which populations are being serviced. In a similar way, collecting demographic data can help identify gaps in care and identify which populations are not serviced equally and equitably. One of our participants said, quote, "Race still plays a huge part." History definitely ties into that, because if you were given less from the beginning and then there's other people that were given more, then you're constantly trying to play catch up in a system that wants you to stay down. DataChat participants also noted that the purpose behind collecting this type of information is important. Some participants had positive experiences with collecting information on their LGBTQ+ identities. For example, if the agency is collecting the information to make sure that you're in a safe environment, like LGBTQ+ inclusive housing, then participants found this beneficial. However, if participants did not know why they were being asked these questions, they noted that it could be a safety concern, which we know would lead them to maybe disclose less accurate information. They also noted that other metrics like current social supports or resources could be more beneficial than collecting demographics. Ultimately, participants emphasized that the needs are the bottom line. Like one participant said, quote, "Race shouldn't really be a factor in someone needing shelter or food in their mouth," unquote. Another participant who aged out of the foster care system pointed out that the burden that this data can put on children and young adults. They said, quote, "When I aged out of foster care, they have all these statistics about foster kids who complete college, who do not complete college, and how many of us are going to end up homeless, right? What's the point of putting that burden on someone at 18 who's about to venture off? Saying that these are statistics of someone who is like you, who looks like you," unquote. Next, we asked participants for their advice. What could help reduce discrepancies in data for people facing homelessness? First, participants noted a need for increased safety. Safety changes across time and place and for different populations. Participants emphasized that for some groups, like undocumented immigrants, nearly every place can be dangerous. Social norms also play a part in discrepancies in data. One of the participants said, "Until very recently, the option to be gender inclusive was not a thing because our society wasn't ready for that." Social norms change over time and can therefore influence data collection, creating the discrepancies that we sometimes see. Another consideration is that trans folks are a nuanced population. They may not have their documents changed, like Aaron. They may be binary trans, like trans male or trans female. They may be non binary. They may medically transition, or they may not medically transition. It's difficult to fit trans folks in a box, like agency forms try to do. So it's important to note that this population is inherently difficult to capture with the ways systems currently collect this type of information. One example that our participants pointed out is that binary trans folks might not even mark transgender as an option, especially if they're further along in their medical transition. Next, for participants pointed out a need for administrative consistency. Records are not always updated by providers, even if they know that someone's information has changed. As noted earlier, name changes may lead to an undercount or an overcount of populations when researchers are unable to link records. And finally, some records may be parent or family reported when someone is a child, but that same person may show up later in the system as an adult having self-reported information. We saw this with Aaron when their family received some housing assistance and SNAP benefits throughout Aaron's childhood, but then Aaron also received SNAP benefits as an adult. So for Aaron, we have self-reported information, but we also have parent-reported information. Next, we asked DataChat participants for their advice on what could help reduce the burden of data intake. Overall, data is inherently burdensome. People seeking services are already in vulnerable situations where their basic human needs are not met in some way. In this way, going through data intake is always going to impart some level of burden, especially for marginalized folks. One of our participants said, "I'm conflicted because I think my job would want me to believe that it is necessary to get this information. I really couldn't give two Fs about data." Participants also said the timing of data collection is important. If possible, ask these questions when people are in safer places like a rehab facility or shelter. If possible, provide resources, compensation, food, transportation, or anything else to meet the needs of these folks. Another important aspect is involving people with lived experience and shared identities. One participant said, quote, "Maybe in the future as youth and young adults lead more of this type of work, my hope is that it does become a lot less burdensome," unquote. Participants also noted that accessibility is important. For example, consider the literacy of folks and meet them where they are at and providing accommodations. Finally, remember that data represent people and their experiences. Oftentimes, a relational component is lacking. Service users are just pushed through systems and feel like numbers on a screen. To this end, one participant said, quote, "Providing food or transient support on the front lines does provide a certain warmth, and there is still someone out there that cares. But at the same time, it's kind of cruel because you know in the back of your head, I need more than this, but thank you," unquote.
All right, so let's summarize what we learned from our data chats. So when looking at administrative data systems, remember to advocate for more inclusive and standard documentation of people's identities. Also, advocate for provider training so that data intake is sensitive to people in vulnerable situations. Lastly, advocate for accessibility and safety as standards in service and data intake. Now, when we are linking administrative data together to inform positive social change, remember that we want to maximize inclusivity when standardizing categorizations of race and gender identities. We want to consider the role of society in generating the data we analyze, and also consider the historical context of the data we are using. The bottom line is that behind data are people, and we must remember those who are represented in the data. Seek to contextualize numbers with experiences. Remember that data tells someone's story, so seek the input and insight of those individuals and foster a collaborative relationship that benefits them.
Let's reflect on Aaron's story. Considering what we've talked about today, think about these questions. What parts of Aaron's story would have been lost if we only had the administrative data? How can systems work together in ways that could have better supported Aaron? Remember how Aaron was worried about going to a men's shelter versus a women's shelter? More inclusive shelter spaces or spaces designed for gender diverse folks may have benefited Aaron. How would Aaron be represented if we only had access to the SNAP data system? Or we only had access to the HMIS data system? Or we only used information their family reported about Aaron when they were a child versus the information Aaron reported about themselves as an adult?
Finally, I'd like us to end with a quote from one of our data chat participants. They said, "I feel like people are eager to share their experience if people are willing to listen." And with that, we're going to conclude Module 2, and we will see you in Module 3.